So when I started my PhD, it felt like a success just to be accepted. It felt like I had this opportunity to do much better than I had as an undergraduate, to show what I was really capable of, and it felt fantastic just to have that. So I started with all these high hopes and high expectations. But it wasn't long before I discovered that it's much easier to get into a PhD program than it is to complete one. And I ended up in my third year basically burned out, incredibly stressed, depressed, overwhelmed, and on the verge of quitting. Now, when I spoke to people about this, they told me, it's okay, don't worry, it's normal, everybody goes through this, it's just part of the PhD process, just keep going and it'll be okay, don't worry, this is just what a PhD is. And so I kept going, but things didn't get any better. And it was only when I made fundamental changes to the way that I was approaching the work that things started to change. I'll talk a little bit more about those later on. But we have this problem where overwhelming PhD stress is so common that many people assume that it's both inevitable and necessary. So you just ignore the problem, right? You just carry on going because it's normal, it'll be okay. But the problem is that stress, some stress can be useful. A little bit of stress can help you to focus. But overwhelming stress, it limits your ability to think, to learn, and to solve difficult problems. And for PhD students or researchers, that's kind of a problem. To illustrate this point, really simple example. If you imagine you have to take a flight, and let's say the public transport is on strike, so there's loads of traffic, it's going to be difficult to get there. Maybe you've had a fight with your partner because you haven't packed in time, and then there's all this stuff and you're running around the house. And then you're looking for your keys. Where are my keys? I'm late. My partner's shouting at me, where are my keys? And you realize they've been in your hand for the last 5 minutes. And that's a really simple example of how stress can make you stupid, right? So we have this situation where we accept that for PhD students who have to operate on the limit of human knowledge, that stress is okay. But, we're human, and stress can limit our ability in so many ways. Now, if this happens occasionally, it's not a big deal, right? Life kind of goes up and down. You will have moments where you're overwhelmed. But when it's normal, when it's your everyday experience, over time that builds up and it can lead to just crippling self-doubt, and in some cases quite serious depression. So I don't think that we should accept that this is just the way a PhD is. I think we can do better. So I think that overwhelming stress is a warning sign that something is wrong, not with you, but with the way that you're approaching the work. So the question is, why is it that so many PhD students suffer from this overwhelming stress, and what can we do about it? So to address this, I'm going to go even more fundamental and ask the question, what is a PhD anyway? What is it fundamentally? What are we trying to achieve? So does anybody want to volunteer an answer? What is the purpose of a PhD? Yep, at the back.
Become an independent researcher.
Okay, to become an independent researcher, that's pretty good. Anyone else? Okay. So this is pretty common. I've given this talk a lot of times. We have like 60, 70 people in the room, and it's very rare that people say, oh yeah, I know what a PhD is, and have a really confident answer. So if you're dedicating 3, 4, 5 years of your life to this thing, you need to have a really, really clear idea of what it is. So this is a list of just some of the answers that I've been given before. Becoming an independent researcher it's up there with the best of them. Some of them that I've seen are a little bit less clear. One really common one: PhD is an original contribution to the body of knowledge, which again is pretty good. There's an element of truth to that. Some people say it's the culmination of a lifetime of study. Some people use metaphors like a PhD is a marathon, not a sprint. Some people say it's the work you'll be remembered for. One person in one talk said it's like a driving license for research, so kind of similar to that answer we had today. Some people will say, well, it's just the natural next step in my education. For some people, it's a way of avoiding major life decisions. And one time, somebody told me that a PhD means that you're the world's leading expert in your field. If that's true, I'm going to give mine back, because that's certainly not the level that I reached. Now, all of these answers or most of them, they have an element of truth to them, but they're kind of like working around the issue. None of them are really, really clear about what you need to do and how you need to approach it. So we can put in a lot of work without really knowing, what the purpose is. So let's re-examine this. So some people say that a PhD is like the culmination of the education system. And in some ways this is true. It's kind of the highest common qualification that you can get. There's a problem with thinking of it this way. Okay? So if you think of it like a pyramid where you have primary education, secondary education, your undergraduate degree, and then at each level, some people leave, some people move up. So you get the best people, the people who've done the best at these lower levels, moving on to a PhD. Okay? The problem with this is that in almost every respect, it's completely different to everything that you've done before. So here I'm using undergraduate to just describe anything, pre-postgraduate. So it could be primary education, it could be all the way up to master's degree in some cases. But there's a consistency to the system. So you have a clearly defined syllabus. So somebody stands at the front of the room, they tell you a bunch of information, which has clear boundaries around it. Okay? In a PhD, you don't have that. There might be certain core concepts, but there's no boundary around what you need to know. At undergraduate level, you're dealing with well-established knowledge. You're dealing with things which have been tested, which have been accepted by your academic field. In a PhD, you're dealing with cutting-edge research, which might be contradictory. It might be ideas that people haven't quite accepted, things that haven't quite been fully tested. You might be dealing with things where there's people just arguing all the time about what is actually the case. At undergraduate level, you have a clear timetable. Down to the level of an individual hour, you need to be in this place at this time and I will teach you this. In a PhD, you might have a submission deadline, like once a year, and that's it. Or you might meet your supervisor once a month. But on a day-to-day basis, on an hour-by-hour basis, it's up to you to decide what you do. At undergraduate level, you have a cumulative grade, so you can screw up one exam and make up for it later. At a PhD, you have one exam, and it's pass or fail, pretty much. And so you can see how there are all these differences where it's not just different, it's the complete opposite of everything that you had to deal with before. Okay? Another quick example, at undergraduate level you have local competition. So to be the best in your class, you just have to beat the other 30 or so or 100 people in your class. At PhD level, you're competing globally. You're competing against other people in your field. Okay? And I'll come back to that point a little bit later. So what we can derive from this is that you get to PhD level by being really good at all the stuff on the left. But when you get to PhD level, everything changes. So the skills that got you this far are not the same skills that help you to succeed. Right? So you can be working really, 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 really hard, but using the old skills. Okay? And that's only going to lead to stress. So you have this situation, you have all of these different skills, all of these ways in which your previous skills are not going to help you, but then nobody really tells you what's required, and you're mostly left to figure it out on your own. So let's redefine it. I think that a PhD level is not the pinnacle of the education system, but it's the entry qualification to the world of professional academia. It's the bottom of the pyramid, it's not the top. Okay, so this is where you develop your basic skills, which you can then take on if you carry on in academia to do world-changing research. Okay, so people put a lot of pressure on themselves to be the best, whereas actually you're a beginner. Okay, and you need to work on those fundamentals. So the aim of a PhD is to develop and then demonstrate the skills of a professional academic researcher. And what does this mean? It basically means that you have to produce work of a publishable standard, which is a pretty high bar, but it's different depending on what field you're working in. So the standard you have to reach is set by the field relative to what already exists in the field, and then it's judged by other academics in the field. Okay, so what you have to achieve very much depends on what is already there. So you need to not only know the literature, to know what has been done, but then also develop a level of skill which is competitive with some of that work, okay, and where that cutting edge currently is right now, which is quite a high bar to reach, but it is doable, okay? So there are basically three main objectives. I'm just going to focus on the first two. So first, getting to know the literature, then developing these professional level academic research skills, and then demonstrating that knowledge and skill through your project and then through the writing. I'm not going to talk about writing. We can come to it in the Q&A just because it's too big a topic, but I'm happy to answer questions about it later on. Okay. So how do we do this? How do we build this expertise, this knowledge of this literature and the research skill? Does anybody have any answers? This is what you're going to have to do, so you need to know. Does anybody have an answer about how you actually get better at something? Practice? Okay. Yeah. Anybody else? Read? Okay. Okay. So again, there's not many confident answers. We've had two answers which are pretty good. Both of those things are essential. But how you practice and how you read makes a big difference. So just doing something again and again and again doesn't necessarily make you better. So if you think about how many people have driving licenses, they drive every single day, but they don't necessarily get better. They're not all Lewis Hamilton. They're not all world-class drivers, despite spending thousands of hours potentially driving, okay? Because what happens is that you repeat the same habits. So doing something again and again doesn't necessarily make you better. There are ways to practice which are more effective than others. And these are the kind of things that you need to know because you're setting your own timetable and you're deciding what you need to do. Okay? Reading, obviously also very, very important, but how you read is crucial, and I'll come to that shortly. So, one of the ways that people think of learning or developing skill is in terms of stress, as stress being essential to learning, okay? That you need to push past your limit in order to grow, kind of like weightlifting, okay? You need to lift heavier weights in order to get stronger. This is, again, sort of almost true, but not quite right. So I'll stick with the weightlifting analogy. So if you go to the gym, you start weightlifting, you want to get stronger. First day, you lift a certain weight. Next day, you go back, you try and lift a little bit more. And then the next day, or a few days later, you try and lift a little bit more. And this will work for a while. You will get stronger, for sure, just from doing something new, just from increasing the load. But what will happen is you'll get stronger, and then you'll reach a plateau, okay? And you can try and lift more weight, and it just doesn't happen. And the reason is that it's not just about increasing the load, because the amount that you can lift, the amount that you can do, depends on technique. It depends on skill. And if you increase the load to a particular point, you reach a point where the limiting factor is the skill. So all you're trying to do is increase the weight, but it's not helping because you're not addressing the fundamental problem, okay? And all you're doing is putting more stress on yourself, and what will probably happen is you actually get weaker or you get injured, okay? So this is a really, really, really crucial principle, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on it. So coming back to that metaphor, a PhD is a marathon, not a sprint. We have this same idea. So some of you may know, a few months ago, Eliud Kipchoge became the first person to run a sub-2-hour marathon. He didn't do this by just running marathons again and again and again as hard as he could until he got faster. If he'd done that, he'd have just broken himself, okay? He wouldn't be, the world-class or world's best marathon runner that he is. What people like that do, whether it's weightlifters, whether it's marathon runners, whether it's professional athletes, or whether it's top-level academics, they spend more time working on the fundamentals than they do at the edge. So in the case of a marathon runner, they don't spend all their time running marathons. What they do is they spend time working on technique, working on strength, working on flexibility, working on nutrition, working on psychology, working on all of these different things, the preparation, which they then test by going to the edge. Okay? So the bulk of the time is spent on the component parts, not on the big performance, like the big competition. Okay? Same thing applies in education. So most of the education system is set up in a particular way, where you take a module as part of a course, then you take an exam, you pass the exam, and then you move on to the next thing. Okay? So we lift the weight, and then we increase the weight once you've succeeded. Okay? But this can leave big holes in your knowledge. So let's say you take the exam at the end of module 1, and you get a really good score, so you score like 80%, right? You're probably near the top of the class. That means that 20% of the material you don't know. And the 80%, there's no guarantee that you'll remember all of that 80%. Okay? So 20% you don't know, but that 20% might be really important. You move on then to the next module, which maybe builds upon those previous principles, but 20% is missing. But we're adding more. Now, I spent a lot of time in university, and I don't remember a single time when anybody said, you need to go back and learn that fundamental thing before we teach you this. As long as you've got a passing grade, you can do the next thing. And what I found was I just got overloaded. I found ways to pass the exams, but those fundamentals were weak, and that's what limited me. Okay? So whether it's weightlifting, marathon running, or academia, the fundamentals are what everything is built upon. Okay? And if you've got any gaps, they get exposed when you go to the edge. So the limit is not where you grow. It's where you test yourself. It's where you test your preparation. It's where you test the skills that you've already established. So what you need to do if you want to improve your skill is to back off from the limit and focus on the component parts that form the foundation of your skills. Okay? So let's apply this to the first of those fundamental aims, getting to know the literature. Okay? So this is coming back to that issue of reading. So most students don't know, at least initially, how to approach the literature, because we've been trained through undergraduate exams where you have a certain syllabus and you have to know as much as possible of that syllabus, and if you miss something, then you're kind of penalized for that. Okay? So you approach the literature, you do a quick search, and you find 10,000 results for a particular thing. And you think, how am I going to learn all of this? How can I possibly absorb all of this information? And so what I get is questions like, how can I read more? How can I read faster? How can I take notes that encompass all of this information? Because people are trying to approach it like an undergraduate exam. But it doesn't work because we're just piling on too much load. We're piling on too much weight. So the aim is not to learn everything, but to identify the fundamentals which we can then use to build kind of a solid knowledge of the literature or apply it to our research. So what you need to do, instead of trying to read more, instead of trying to read faster, instead of trying to increase that load, is to try to select individual papers that help you to achieve a specific aim. So if you can identify common concepts, okay, this helps to reduce the load a little bit. So if you take a random sample of 1,000 papers, throughout those 1,000 papers, if they're related in some way, they will have a limited number of common concepts that run through them. So if you can identify and understand those common concepts, then you have a foundation for understanding all of those other ones, right? All of the papers. If you don't, then reading more is not going to help, especially because, generally speaking, academic papers are not written to teach, right? They're written with the assumption that you already have that shared kind of common knowledge. So by spending time focused on the shared concept, on the fundamentals, once you've got that, then you can accelerate. Then you can add more papers, right? Because you've got the foundation to do it. Okay? In addition to common concepts, there are also common techniques. It's the same kind of idea. And then you also have major breakthroughs. So again, if we take this random selection of, say, 1,000 papers, the majority of them are not going to be that important, okay? In the sense that they won't have had much influence on the field. Okay? Collectively, they're important, but individually, they might not have had that much influence. But there might be a handful, like 1 or 2 or 3, which have fundamentally changed the way that everybody thinks about that kind of problem. Okay? So what happens is every so often you have a new discovery, a new theory, a new invention that changes the way that we approach things fundamentally. Then this kind of sends these shockwaves throughout the literature, right? And other people respond to it, taking those new innovations and then applying them to special cases or testing little details, ironing out the kinks, right? So that incremental work is essential, but in order to understand it, you need to understand the breakthrough initially. It gives you a foundation for understanding everything else that followed, okay? In addition to that, you also need to understand the current trends in the literature. What are the kinds of things that people are doing? What are the kinds of things that people are working on? So you get this kind of context, which maybe doesn't need to be as detailed, but once you sort of know the landscape, then if you decide, okay, I really need to sharpen up my knowledge of the literature in this particular area, if you've got these 4 aspects, you can then do that really quickly. You can go through 100 papers and get a sense of, okay, this is really important, but you can't do that without the foundation, okay? So you need to slow down, identify these component parts, work on them until you've mastered them, then you can speed up, right? Don't worry about the speed of reading first, because all you're going to do is stress yourself out. There's one other thing that you need to know that doesn't fit into these categories, and that's basically anything which is directly relevant to your research, so kind of your direct competition. So there might be papers which are really crucial to you, but they're not major breakthroughs, okay? So anything which is kind of, they're doing something similar but in a different context, you really need to know those papers as well, okay? So they don't necessarily serve as a foundation for everything else, but they're very, very relevant for you, okay? So when you break the literature down in this way, it becomes a lot easier to do, but you've got to back off from the edge, you've got to slow down in order to do it. Okay, taking the same idea and applying it to your basic research skills. So one of the problems that people often face is they want to get results immediately, okay? Because you start a PhD, you want to impress your supervisor, you want to get good results, you want to do world-class, world-changing research, and so that's what you do. You aim high, right? But if you focus on results before skills, then all you're going to be is frustrated. So your initial goal is to just get really good at the techniques that you're doing and develop robust and reliable processes, which you can then apply to interesting problems. And then it's just a matter of finding something interesting to work on and doing it diligently. So how you develop those skills. It's not just practice. What you have to do is break down the process and practice, test, refine, and repeat every individual part. So if, for example, if you're doing, say, some kind of massive survey, right, some kind of quantitative research, and you go out and you get 10,000 responses, right, so you get a huge amount of data, okay? If you do that on that large scale, the results that you get are going to be limited by the quality of the processes that you follow. And if you start with that massive data set, it's going to be incredibly hard to find any problems, right? If something goes wrong, how do you even find it? So what you need to do is start on a small scale, identify every single step, practice it, test it, and refine it until you're really good. Then you can go out and get your data set of 10,000 people, having gone through that process. So when you break it down into individual component parts, you will face problems, you will face difficulties, okay? And it could be something as simple as, if you have a survey and one of the questions is ambiguous, right? That can be quite a tricky problem to solve. It takes some thought. But if you slow down, narrow your focus, and stay with it, it becomes solvable relatively easily. If you don't do that, then you're always going to be limited on that larger scale by those smaller things. Okay? So slow down, focus on the component parts, and you will go faster in the long run. Okay? So it's difficult to do, it takes time, but you're not here to avoid difficulty, right? But we want to make sure that these difficulties that you face are actually solvable. This is the way to do it. There's one more piece to this, which is to ask for help. So I'm saying that you need to be really good at every part of the process, because any weakness in the chain is going to affect the whole. But you don't have to be brilliant at everything. Everybody has certain strengths and weaknesses. And one of the reasons why universities or organizations like Insight exist is to bring together people with different expertise, different strengths, different skills. And so it's really important to get to know other people and what they do. So when you're facing a problem and that person down the corridor or that person that I met at the conference in Galway who's working on this thing, you can ask them, right? And usually people are pretty happy to be approached as an expert and asked how to do things. Okay? So collaboration is really, really crucial, and building up a network where you can call on people is also an essential skill. You don't have to do it all on your own. This is another thing that kind of relates to the way the education system is set up. From an early age in school, you're told that copying from your neighbor or asking your neighbor what the answer is cheating, right? We need to let go of that and think, well, okay, that person knows, let's just ask them. You don't have to do it all on your own. It's not an entirely individual pursuit. Okay, so let's say you do all this perfectly, you really take on board all of these principles. Things are still going to go wrong. It's the nature of research that you're trying things which haven't been done before, and you're pushing up against not only your own limits, but the limits of what anybody knows in some cases. And if you're doing something ambitious, things will go wrong. Right? How you respond to that is crucial, right? You can never plan everything perfectly that no mistakes happen. So how you respond when things go wrong is crucial. In my case, in my PhD, I didn't handle this well. So just to go back to my own story a little bit. So I was working on an instrument development project. It was this kind of machine that was supposed to combine all of these different techniques. And various PhD students had worked on it over a course of several years. So there was this kind of Frankenstein's monster of a machine, which wasn't very reliable. And my job was basically to try and get it working. And so it broke down constantly, right? It was not just it wasn't just like the final experiments. It was like the basic functioning of the machine. The basic things just didn't work most of the time. So it was incredibly frustrating and incredibly slow progress. And in some cases, I would go into work in the morning, I would break something, and so my productivity was negative. I would have been better off not going into work because I'd be like 2 or 3 days behind as a result of what I'd done. And I developed this habit when these things went wrong of checking email as a way of kind of avoiding the problem. Checking email was kind of like an anesthetic that was easily justifiable to sort of avoid the problem. But then there was one day when I was working in the lab, I was working with these optical fibers. And anyone who's worked with optical fibers before knows that one of the useful things about them is they're flexible, right? You take these glass fibers and because of the plastic coating, you can bend them around corners. What I had to do, for reasons I won't go into, is remove the plastic coating from these fibers, which would leave a strand of glass, maybe 2 inches long, about the thickness of a human hair. So they were obviously incredibly fragile, and there were various processing steps. So things would break, so I'd make them in batches, and hopefully some of them would survive long enough. But it was about a 2 or 3 day process to prepare these things. So I was near the end of this process, I had this batch that I'd been working on for a couple of days. I was moving them from one part of the lab to the other, and I dropped them. And as far as I know, those fibers are still on the floor of that lab because they're impossible to ever find once they go. And typically, my response would have been to check email, to find a way of avoiding the problem, just as a break, right? But that time, not only did I break the fibers, but something inside me broke as well. And I swore loudly, stormed out of the lab, stormed out of the building, because I just had enough. Nothing was working. I was putting in so many hours, and it just didn't seem to matter what I did. I wasn't making progress, so what was the point? So I walked across campus, not knowing where I was going, not knowing even if I was going to go back. Found a bench next to the lake, really nice spot, sat down just to think. And I thought, I can't take this anymore. Why am I doing this? Why am I putting myself through this? It's just not going to work. Why keep going? And I thought about it for a little while, and I thought, well, okay, if I quit, it's not going to be great, but it's, my day-to-day life isn't great anyway. I'm super stressed. I would have to explain to my supervisor, but he would understand, I think. He's seen what I've been going through. I'd have to explain to my family, to my friends, and people would be disappointed, but they'd be okay. I thought, well, okay, I need to find a job. Well, I'll find something. I'll survive. I'll be okay. It's not the worst thing that can happen. So I thought, well, actually, quitting, it's not as bad as maybe I thought. But then I thought, well, okay, there's still a couple of things I can try with the experiments. So why don't I try those things, and then if they don't work, then I'll quit, and I'll be okay with that. But I just want to give it one last shot, make sure I've done everything I can. But if I'm going to try those things, and that's going to decide whether or not I'll stay, I need to be sure that I've absolutely given it my best shot. And I knew that I'd been kind of rushing things. I knew that I'd been kind of undermining myself in some ways. So I decided I'm going to just do this as carefully as I possibly can. Right? I'm going to be absolutely meticulous in every single step of this process. So I kind of calmed myself. I went back to the lab, cleaned up, started again, and just did everything really, really slowly with ridiculous attention to detail. I did it as slowly as I possibly could. And things started to work. I thought, shit, now I can't quit. So, but it taught me something that, I've been so pressured to get results. I've been so focused on getting results that I was undermining myself, right? I was so worried about the end result that I was making failure more likely. And all I needed to do was slow down. And that was it. So, things started to turn around. I kept up this habit. I slowed down. I did things carefully. I got a couple of publications, which was enough to write up my thesis. And then wrote my thesis in just 3 months and passed my Viva with 0 corrections. So the turnaround from being on the verge of quitting forever to that was remarkable. And there were 3 basic things that I changed. So first of all, as I said, I focused on just doing each component part as carefully as possible. Not trying to go fast, not trying to worry about the end result, just doing each part as carefully as I could. Second, I stopped checking email whenever things went wrong. And then later, when I started writing my thesis, I got rid of my internet connection completely. Just a quick question, actually. How many people check email before getting out of bed every day? There's always like this slow ripple of honesty that goes through the audience. Yeah. How many people have checked email while I've been speaking? It's okay, I'm not offended. Okay, so here's the thing. Email is so easy and so easily justifiable. And it's kind of the default that we go to. It's the default habit that we do without thinking whenever there's a moment of discomfort. And the problem is it then leads into distraction because you've got other people's information coming in and then you forget what you were doing, right? You forget why you even checked email in the first place. There might not have even been a reason. There might not have been a conscious thought. It just happened, right? And the thing is that when you're doing research, you're going to face those moments of discomfort where you don't know what to do. And if the first thing you do, if your first instinct when you wake up is to check email, that's what you're going to do when you face a problem in your research. And then you have no chance because you're not focusing on the problem in front of you, and there's no way you can solve it. So that was another key, absolutely key thing. Not having the internet while I was writing meant that if I faced any kind of block, I could just stay with it instead of reaching for email. That was a really, really crucial thing. And finally, I stopped worrying about the end results, not just individual experiments, but I stopped caring what the examiners thought. So, I mentioned I wasn't the best student as an undergraduate, so there were gaps in my knowledge. There were some quite big and embarrassing gaps in my knowledge as a physicist, which I'd never gone back and addressed. And I always worried throughout my PhD, what if the examiner asks me some basic undergraduate physics thing that I can't answer? Right? I was always worried about that. What if they ask me something that, what if they point out some mistake in my research? Even if it's not that fundamental. And I just decided to stop caring about that and focus on what I could control, right? And that kind of took the pressure off, and I could just do what I did. And that came across in the writing as much more confident, and then the examiners really liked it in the end. So by not worrying about it, I actually made it. By not worrying about failure, I made failure less likely. So this brings me to the point of confidence, which I think is crucial. Confidence doesn't come from knowing exactly how things will work out. When you're doing research, you never know the answer unless you're doing like something really boring, right? If you're doing exciting, important work, you don't know if it's going to work. So you can't base your confidence on that. You can't base your confidence on being certain that you're going to pass your PhD. Confidence comes from accepting the risk and doing it anyway, giving it your best shot and saying, you know what, I don't know what the examiner's going to think, but I can cope with whatever happens. Right? I might fail my PhD, but I can deal with that. It's not going to be the worst thing that happens, and that just frees you up to do the kind of work that you need to do. Okay, so we'll get into the Q&A, and we can dive a little bit deeper into any of these concepts or cover any of the things that I haven't already covered. But I just want to finish one final tip. So I've mentioned the importance of asking for help, knowing what other people are doing. This builds on the points that Professor O'Connor made earlier about networking. Key to networking is to not worry about yourself and what you do, but just be interested in what other people do. If you want people to be interested in you, be interested in them, and they will naturally start asking questions. Okay, I was going to make this point about the professional network, but it's already been made. Both of my postdoc contracts came about through people I knew. Okay, I applied for stuff that was advertised, but everything came through people I knew. That is probably just as important as all the skills you develop is the network that you build. So I'll finish on that note, and we'll get into the Q&A. These are some typical things that come up pretty often, but you can ask me about anything else as well. So that's it from me. Any questions?
As a responsibility as well.
Sure.
PhD students. So, what should PhD students be requesting, requiring, demanding from supervisors? I ask in the knowledge of some of my own team or in the audience here. So, I'd like to hear your perspective on that.
Okay. I think the first thing to say is that supervisors are in a really difficult position because just like PhD students get to be PhD students by being really good at undergraduate level, supervisors become supervisors by being, generally speaking, good at research. Nobody teaches them how to supervise. You maybe have I mean, how much training do you have? Like an afternoon, if you're lucky, right? And so you're put in this position where you're responsible for this big chunk of these people's lives. And some people do it well, some people do it badly. And that makes it makes a huge, huge, huge difference. My general tip for PhD students is be really careful about who you work with in the first place, because the basic attitude of the supervisor can be quite different. Some people, I was very lucky in terms of my supervisor, because he was very much a facilitator. Right? His job was to help me achieve the standard, or help his students achieve the standard, and he would do anything, to help out. Other supervisors see themselves as kind of a barrier, like you have to meet my standard before I'll even speak to you. In some cases, so that choice of supervisor is on the choice. I'll make this a more general point. The choice of who you work with at any stage of your career is probably more important than what you do. So choose someone you can work with. But for a lot of people, you're already with somebody, so it might be too late. In terms of what you should ask for, I think the first thing is to be open about what you don't know, because a lot of students will have this kind of imposter syndrome. Right? So you know what you don't know and you don't want to show it. You want to impress your supervisor. And so a lot of students are very reluctant to say that they're struggling. So that would be one thing. The other thing would be to try to get feedback as early in the process as possible. So in some cases, I'll use writing as an example, and applies to research as well. In some cases, what happens is the supervisor will give feedback on the thesis once there's an entire draft, either of a chapter or the whole thesis. When you've got an entire draft, it's very hard to make any adjustment to the basic writing skill. Right? So this is like, I'll go back to the weightlifting analogy. You're lifting as much as you possibly can, and then somebody says, "Oh, adjust this," but you're already under too much load. Right? There's just too much to take in. Right? If you look at a short piece of writing, and in some cases it could be a page, right? If you've read a lot of academic work, if it's on the right track or not. And you know that people tend to be fairly consistent, because if the first page is bad, the rest of it is going to be bad. So if you can identify what they need to change on a small section of writing and teach them the principle behind it, and often it will be things like, you're just trying to communicate too much, I don't know what you're trying to say, simplify it, right? You teach them that principle, then they can apply it to the next 10 pages, and then they can apply it to the next 100, right? So it's getting feedback as early in the cycle as possible. It saves work for the supervisor as well, because you don't have 200 pages to correct. And same idea applies with research. So test it on a small scale, get feedback, and definitely don't let your defense be the first time you get feedback, because that's a recipe for disaster. Okay.
Any other questions?
Thanks so much for your talk. You mentioned the imposter syndrome, which I think is something that a lot of students struggle with and don't always fess up to. How would you recommend dealing with that or becoming more involved?
Okay. So if you think about what an imposter is somebody who is pretending to be something else. And so if you feel like an imposter, you try and it's basically because you feel like you don't have the knowledge or the skill, or you don't deserve to be there. Then as an imposter, you try to hide it, right? So you try to show how good you are, or you just avoid getting feedback, right? And so it means that when you face some kind of problem, you don't ask anybody, because that means admitting that you don't know that thing, right? So when I was a PhD student, And I was kind of thinking, oh, what if somebody finds out? What if somebody asked me to recite the laws of thermodynamics, which is like first year undergraduate physics? And I could kind of muddle my way through, but it's kind of embarrassing, right? If I hide that, then I don't fix it. Instead, what I could have done is say, you know what? I've kind of forgotten a lot of stuff. Do you mind if I sit in on one of these first year lectures? And I guarantee my supervisor would have loved that, right? Because it's a great attitude to have. So it's really just being open about it and addressing those problems. If you see a weakness, go and ask for help. That is really it. There might still be a psychological barrier to it, but it means that if you out yourself, it means that nobody can find you out, right? So you completely avoid that problem.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm going to try to ask this question. So, I like in academia, one of the keys that you've mentioned is don't focus so much on the let's say, on the result, and focus on the process and developing your skills and all of this. But in a way, the way academia is being structured, at least now, I feel, is my thoughts. We are guided towards these results, like we are judged every year about these results. And in computer science especially, we need to be publishing papers, and it's so kind of, in a way, every 2 or 3 months or something, people are just publishing. And there's obviously this pressure. So it's a question, so my question would be, it's a fundamental thing in academia that might be a problem, and that's why we're getting PhDs with all this stress, because that's how academia is being structured right now.
Yeah.
So you agree? So how would you change? Because you mentioned things about how we would change our approach as PhDs, but then how do we look at the broader picture as well?
Yeah. So you do, of course, you need the end result. Right? That needs to be there. So I gave the example of like world-class marathon runners, right? They still have to go out and do the competition, of course, right? So and I also said you need to produce work of a publishable standard. And you will have heard the phrase publish or perish, right? It's fundamental, right? If you don't publish, you're going to be out of a job pretty soon, right? The question is how you get to that publication. So if your focus is just on, I need to have this publication in 3 months, like no matter what, and you take the easiest route to that publication, then you can probably find something that hasn't been done before, and you can get it in a journal. But is it really worthwhile, interesting work? Okay. And the problem then that you have is you're then competing against everybody else who's just trying to churn out papers as fast as possible without doing interesting work. So you can't differentiate yourself in that way, right? So when it comes to review, maybe you've got 100 papers, but somebody else has got 150. It's like, I need another 100 and I need another 50. That's not why we're doing this. We're doing this to actually make some kind of difference and make some good discoveries. So it's finding that balance of, yes, you need to publish, but you also need to find difficult, worthwhile problems to work on. So what I would say is take the pressure off a little bit in terms of that end result, and try and find an interesting problem and then break it down and focus on the component parts. And what you probably find is one of those component parts, maybe that has a spin-off publication, because you find an interesting way to do something, right? So so often in these big discoveries, it'll be some step in the process which is kind of key, and then you get a publication out of that, and then you then also get the big publication of something which is potentially game changing, right? If you look at any of the kind of Nobel Prize winners. My favorite example is always Richard Feynman, because I'm a physicist. Now he's known for all sorts of different things, But some of the things that he used to do would be like go back to basic algebra and reprove why 1 + 1 = 2, right? As like probably the best physicist of the latter half of the 20th century, right? So he was doing that stuff on a basic level, but also doing this amazing kind of world-changing research at the same time. And he published, tons and tons and tons of papers. So it's having that balance of backing off from that need to just produce. But then what you find is that by doing that and focusing on these smaller steps, right, you actually produce more and better work anyway. One book that I would recommend reading is Deep Work by Cal Newport. He's a computer scientist, and he also talks about ways of generating more higher quality papers as well. I just read it a couple of weeks ago. It's excellent, so I'd recommend that. Okay.
Okay, so it's just a small question. I know you said we won't talk a lot about academic writing.
Sure.
But I'm first year PhD student, and as far as I talk with other people finishing their PhD, there's kind of two approaches for writing thesis, which can be challenging task. Either start writing from the first year small pieces and then gather it all together, or just wait till the third year and then start rushing to write. So I couldn't make my mind which one would be the best. Is there an approach, or is it depends on the person?
I think to some extent it depends on the person. I think there is some value to practicing writing early, but specifically seeing it as practice, and not trying to write entire thesis chapters. I know there are some people who say, well, if you write a chapter per semester, then after a couple of years you have your full thesis. I've never seen that work. Because, for example, if you write a literature review in your first year, by the time you reach your final year, you should be able to write a much better literature review. So you're going to have to rewrite it anyway. But what it depends upon is basic writing skill. So if you try and write everything at the end and you don't know how to construct a coherent argument, then it's going to be incredibly stressful. But the same applies if you start in your first year and you just start writing bits. Practice isn't enough. You need to know the principles of structure, right? So at whatever point you start, you need to have that skill. I'll give you one principle because I know we don't have much time, which I think makes a massive difference to writing. I'll give you two. First of all, narrow the scope. So one of the big problems people have with writing is they just know too much about their particular subject, and then they're trying to show the examiner how much they know, right? You've got to abandon that way of thinking and try and focus on a limited number of ideas. Select from your body of knowledge what you want to communicate. The more you try and cram in, the more confusing it gets, right? It becomes counterproductive. So you've got to select. So then what you can do is start practicing writing with a fairly simple concept. You focus on one concept, right? One idea, one theory, or one technique that you want to write about. Then there's a structure that you can follow that works for pretty much anything. And that is to start with a situation, then describe a problem, and then you can describe either a solution or different ways people have approached the problem. So let's say you're writing about it could be a theory or it could be a technique. And before the invention of that technique or before the development of that theory, there was a problem that existed. So how do we measure X, right? And that problem was important because measuring X is necessary in order to do some other things. Then you can say, then you can present a solution, right? So in 1973, this person developed this technique where the key insight was this. So the description of the technique fits into the context of that original problem. It's a response to that original problem. Then, that technique, it has some kind of effect on the field. Right? So I mentioned before about that you have these groundbreaking discoveries and then you have incremental work that follows. So that technique, you could say, this then spawned a number of different variations ranging from this to this to this. Or you could say this then became the standard technique for doing this until the development of some other technique. Right? Or you could say this became the standard technique. However, there was a problem in that it was limited to these circumstances. So there we have a situation, a problem that, a situation and a problem which is like, how do we measure this thing? We have a response to it, but then there's another problem that comes along, and then another technique maybe responds to that problem. So everything is framed as a response to whatever came before. And then you have a narrative. Okay? It could also be in terms of a theory. Someone proposes this theory, but then other people respond and say, well, hang on, there's a problem with this, and then something else develops and you get a debate. Right? So if you can think of things in terms of situations or problems that arise from situations and then responses, that can kind of structure your writing. And then you have this kind of scaffold to hang the ideas off. And if you can do that, then you can write about anything. But it takes practice. Okay. If we've got time for one more? Sure.
I want to ask for help that you talked about. What I see a lot is just like, I was just like, PhD needs to be all in my work, like no one should be around it, either because people will steal it, or just because like they should not help me, otherwise it cannot be my thesis. So what you see, like people actually isolate themselves to, at the end of the PhD, they just come out, oh, okay, now I finished my PhD, now I can start like collaborating or talk with other people. So how do you see, for example, collaboration during the PhD?
Yeah. That issue of, maybe someone will steal my work. I mean, it happens. I've known it happen to people, and it's horrible, right? And it's really scary. But it doesn't happen that often. It's not the default. Right? And the greater risk is you just isolate yourself to such an extent that, first of all, isolation is horrible and you get really lonely and it's a long time to spend just on your own, and it's, why put yourself through that? But also you miss out on so many opportunities to make your work better. So maybe nobody steals your work, but your work isn't worth stealing anyway because you've done it on your own. So in my case, I was really lucky in that, being an experimental physicist, you can't do it at home, and they won't leave you alone because the equipment might cost half a million euros, and they're not going to let you do it unless they kind of know what you're doing, right? So it just wasn't an option to completely isolate yourself. And also there was kind of quite a sociable atmosphere. So there were coffee breaks every day, and everybody basically knew what everyone else was working on, at least within our research group. I think there could have been more between research groups, certainly, but at least within our research group, it was pretty good. And that not only made it a nicer place to work, but it also meant that I found out about things that I never would have looked for, right? So, people working on these all sorts of obscure things, you just hear about stuff, and then you never know how that's going to be relevant later on. There was one guy who was working on this kind of computer modeling, which seemed to be completely removed from what I did, but actually in my final year, I ended up using some of his code because I discovered something that was sort of related. My PhD was much better as a result. Also, in terms of my knowledge of the literature, there were things that I never would have searched for, and there were also times when people would say, "Oh, I know you're working on this. I just found this paper. It might be relevant." Right? All kinds of sort of unintended things. So, yes, it is a risk that some people might steal some of your work or steal the idea, but I think it's a greater risk to completely isolate yourself. I think it depends very much on the context. So if you meet somebody at a conference for the first time and they seem a little bit too interested, maybe back off. But generally speaking, I would say, talk about what you're doing. Most people aren't going to steal it because they've got enough on their plate. And also, if you're good, then if you just say, hey, I'm working on this, if you've been working on it for 3 years and they can publish faster than you in 3 months, there's a problem there, right? So just get really good at what you do, be open with people, and it shouldn't be too much of a problem. I'll add one more thing. Let's say somebody does steal your idea and they scoop you. If you've got a solid set of research skills which you've built up, it's not that difficult to switch and find something else. You can, in the final stages of your PhD, if you're good, you can say, okay, fine, I've been scooped, let's go in this direction. And if you've got the skills, you can do things relatively quickly. The skills are your safety net, not isolation. Okay.
Maybe one or two more questions.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you very well because the microphone's not working. Maybe swap mics and then it might.
So my question is, what is the role of as a research group in order to manage the state of an individual PhD student? Normally, for a supervisor, he will be the student in a week or 2 weeks. But those are the peers who basically he impact a lot. I'm asking this because last year there were so many PhD suicide cases in US where there was a strict competition coming inside from the group itself. So how, as a being a peer, they can help the students where it can be things that peers are itself a collaborator instead of a competitor.
Okay. So in terms of how the group can help individual students, it's a really good question because it depends so much on the group dynamics. I think that one simple thing is just having time where people are just talking, right? As I mentioned in my own research group, there were coffee breaks. Well, this was in the whole physics department. There were coffee breaks every day where people would just talk. So that avoided that kind of issue of isolation. Doesn't necessarily deal with all of the stress, but I think that's a crucial part of it. Just having some kind of interaction. When I did my first postdoc contract in France, my boss wouldn't let me start work until we'd had a coffee together, right? So we were discussing stuff all the time, and that was really important. And also, everybody in the research group went for lunch together, right? And nobody ever ate lunch at their desks. And that social interaction, that communication, I think was really key. It's difficult to change a group dynamic, though, if you're already in it. You can't be responsible for what other people do. So often, a lot of the responsibility for managing the stress will come down on the individual. So there are various things that you can do. I'd say initially to take the edge off the stress. It's really just initially slowing down. And I would say giving yourself a little bit of time and space to think. In my case, towards the end of my PhD, what I was doing was when I hit a problem, instead of checking email, I would just take a walk to give myself time to think. And I would just go back when I was ready. So the stress level would come down, and then I was still engaged with the problem. So that habit worked quite well. There are other things you can do, like meditation, to take the stress off. But if you're not addressing the things you do in your work, then that's not really going to help that much. You'll feel good for 10 minutes, and then you go straight back into it. So it's an interesting question about what the group can do. I probably need to think about it a little bit more. But I would say just that group interaction where people are talking and doing that on a daily basis, and then going then going back to your work. I think if I was going to say one thing, it would probably be that. But I might have a different answer if I think about it a little bit more.
Hi guys. Just following on from what you said, would you like to speak further on the importance of other things during your PhD? You tend to do your PhD in the vacuum, and I know when I was doing mine, I read a lot of papers, and I forgot to read novels. I forgot to enjoy myself and do things that I used to always do when I was younger, like read books, go to the cinema, just take time out to be yourself. And I think you can forget to do that during your PhD. It's really important to do that, because thinking in other ways helps you to think within your PhD as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to some extent you've answered your own question. I absolutely agree that you need that downtime. If you're constantly pushing, working harder, then it ends up being counterproductive. When people don't know what to do or what to change in their process, the most obvious thing is just to work more. But there's a limit to what you can do with that. But then people push on that limit and start having less sleep. And as soon as you start doing that, then everything falls apart, because sleep is really, really fundamental. So I would say, in order for that stuff to compete with the PhD, it needs to come first. So if you treat it like, I'll do that if I get enough work done. I'll go out for dinner with a friend, or I'll do exercise, or cook myself a healthy meal, or whatever. If that depends on getting enough work done first, it'll always be pushed out of the way, because there's always more work that you could do. So in order for that stuff to compete, it has to be like absolutely ring-fenced. I do this, right? This is a fixed part of my routine, and the PhD fits around it. In my case, so I used to be a competitive martial artist, and I was actually teaching at the university club. So I had that commitment 3 times a week. I was teaching, and then I was doing my own training, and competing and stuff at the weekends. And I found that as soon as I stepped on the mat, I stopped thinking about the PhD, and that was really, really crucial to have something else. It's not just important to. It kind of gives the brain a little bit of a break, and sometimes when you're doing other things, that's when you solve problems. So it's not only useful for that, but also just on a personal level, it means that if your PhD goes horribly wrong, let's say it goes as badly as you can imagine, right, and you just fail, you've still got other things in your life, right? You've got those social connections to fall back on. Right? If all you've got is your PhD for 4 years and then that goes wrong, that's a really bad place to be. So I absolutely agree that stuff needs to be in there, and it needs to be the first thing that goes in your timetable, and it needs to be done like no matter what. It's a commitment to do that. Even if it's just like a yoga class once a week or something, it needs to be in there, and it's non-negotiable. Any more?
Thank you very much. So if you can join me in this.
Thank you.